two shipwreck stories and a sad story that no one wants to have an end to because it's a sad ending. The story of the 1948, the story first told in 1948 by Silvio Chiarelli of Trieste, Italy. I don't know how to pronounce it. 1948, he told the story to a Dutch-Indonesian newspaper called De Locomotief. It means the locomotive, but it sounds like motif. And it was under a subheading or section of the paper called Summerlich Handels en Adventie Blad. I have no idea what that means. News of the day and ships at sea or whatever. And the story was about the Orang Madana. This Orang Madana story doesn't have a ship that's actually been listed anywhere. There's no proof it ever existed, and this is the only source of it. But it goes something like this. A ship was found after a radio transmission ending in I die, SOS kind of signal. And when people got to the ship, somehow, they found it loaded with people who were dead, apparently uninjured, but they were all dead and had ghastly looks on their faces. And just before anybody could think to do anything about this, the ship suddenly caught on fire and exploded and sank, with the rescue people running off the ship dramatically. So no evidence to pick up, and it's just one of those just so stories about ship-based horror. It's literally a shipman's, well, nightmare story. This is horror stories for ships at seas and that sort of stuff. It'll keep you awake at night if you're on a long watch. Maybe a little bit better than coffee. Anyway, that story was told in 1948. Now let's look at another story. 1929, November 29th. During a storm, the unladen freighter, now the Swallow, the Norwich City, was carrying a crew of 35 men when it ran aground on a reef at the northwest end of a small Central Pacific atoll known as Gardner Island or Nikamururu Island. This will become important later. A fire broke out in the engine room after impact, and all hands abandoned ship in darkness, having to make their way across a 2,000-foot wide coral reef, sharp edges and all. Being pounded by dangerous storm waves, 11 of them didn't make it. The survivors camped near a collapsed late 19th century coconut planting project structure and were rescued after several days on the island. Its devastated wreck was a prominent landmark in the reef and was used as a way to navigate around it for 70 years. By 2010, the only thing visible above water was the engine, but from satellites you can still see it. It's a very, very obvious shape, and it's moved around a lot. See also that there's a sudden blue spot on the upper right-hand corner of this atoll. An atoll is an island with a big hole in it, basically. It's a ring-shaped island. That blue spot is a cliff going down 1,000 feet. It's just a slide of doom all the way to the bottom of the ocean, to the depths. Now we'll spring forward just a little ways. Now this was a well-known story. It's very similar to the nightmare story, and it's the kind of thing people would pass around and would become viral. So everybody would know about this thing and probably sit there and memorize its location on a map and its shape and size. 1937, July 2nd, midnight, in New Guinea, in an area called Lie. I think that's the pronunciation. Destination, Howland Island, and a ship near it, the Itasca. This trip is 2,556 miles. This is being done with an aircraft with one pilot and one navigator. A well-experienced navigator. And just before taking off, they add in some equipment. We'll be discussing that somewhere in this video. As they left, about 800 miles into the flight, the last known position reported placed this aircraft near Nuka Manunu Islands. I want to give you the names again. Nuka Manunu Island, at about 800 miles into it. Not to be confused with the other island I just talked about, which now has the name Nuka Maroro. Nor would it be like Nauru or Gilbert Islands or Garden Island or anything else similar to that. By 2:45 a.m. and 5 a.m., routine reports were received by this ship, X number of miles still away, stating the weather is cloudy and overcast. By 6:14 a.m., remember this is July, and just below the equator, but it's on the equator basically, another call was received stating the aircraft was within 200 miles of Howland Island and of the Istika. And I'm going to include links to a map, but this map ends in maps and photos maps LOP map.jpg. And it'll show you that the Baker Island and Howland and such, and it'll show you a line going to the right, down and to the right, just after crossing the equator. It's kind of important, by the way. Think of where all these people were from when they were learning to navigate and that sort of thing, and I'll discuss the hardware in a minute. At 6:45 a.m., the pilot made another call, estimating they were 100 miles off Howland Island, and radioed for a bearing to be sent. No response was given, or at least they didn't hear one. 7:42 a.m., we must be on top of you. We can't see you. Gas is running low. Have been able to reach you by radio. We're at 1,000 feet. Then 7:58. Pilot, I can't hear anything you're saying. Please send voice signals so I can try to make radio bearing with this equipment. Eventually, the pilot acknowledged receiving Morse code signals that were sent, as the ship could not send voice at the frequency that was asked for by the pilot. And the response came, I'm unable to determine your direction and bearing. These transmissions were reported as being the loudest possible signal. The aircraft was right over them. They just couldn't see each other, because even though this was 8 a.m. approximately, the clouds made blotches on the sea, and this island that they were trying to land on, which was essentially an almost perfectly made, naturally occurring landing strip in the middle of the ocean, a little island about a mile long and 500 feet across, perfect landing spot, looked too much like clouds from above on the water. Couldn't distinguish it. And there's enough cloud cover that they weren't able to communicate with each other even 1,000 feet up. So, radio broadcast at 8:43 a.m. We are on the line 157337. These are reciprocals, by the way, apparently. We will repeat this message. We will repeat this on 6.21 megahertz. Wait. However, a few moments later, the pilot was back on the same frequency originally, which was 3.105 megahertz, with a transmission that was logged as questionable or garbled. But since then, various people who heard it or repeated it have come to a conclusion about what it said, unfortunately too late. It seemed to indicate that the pilot and the navigator in this aircraft believed they had reached Howland's charted position, which was incorrect by about 5 nautical miles. And the problem is they're trying to land on a 1 mile across island, blotchy conditions, bad visibility, and they might be 5 miles off. That's a very large distance for a little tiny island like that. But this is a mandatory stop to refuel. And it had been mentioned that they were running out of fuel, and let's make the note of the time for this. 7:42 a.m. they were running out of fuel, starting to run out. At this point, it's an hour later and they're running out of fuel. And I'm going to read back what was typed out or written out. This is the shorthand, the original shorthand. The call sign for the aircraft, to Istika. We are on the line 157337. WL, repeat message. We will repeat this on 6.210 megacycles. Wait. And then the next part of it just has the notation of the frequency that they were at originally, and saying the following: north, east, south, south line. There's a lot of other things going on here. That frequency was restricted to aviation use only by the FCC in the United States, but was considered not useful for broadcasting over great distances, and it failed after 1,000 miles. But they were right on top of them. This aircraft had a 50-watt transmitter and a 5-band, 5-load coil tunable loop antenna for direction finding. But the pilot was unfamiliar with it, and so was the navigator, since it was added at the last minute, and they weren't receiving any real instruction about it. They weren't really told how to use any of it. Nobody thought it would be needed. I mean, you're within 5 miles of something, you should be able to see them. But if you're on the ground, 3 miles is the horizon. And if you're 1,000 feet up, that adds some distance. But if it's overcast and you can't hear anything, even if people are firing shots or shooting flares, there's a problem. And the radio signals weren't being received because it's possible that the antenna was broken on the bottom. Transmit's easy, receiving's hard. For 5 nights after this, the Navy and Pan American Airways stations picked up distress signals whose bearings crossed Nicamaroro, which was 360 miles south-southeast of Howland Island on that exact bearing. But it took them a week to get a battleship carrying airplanes out there, or anybody else out there. And by that time the signals had been stopped because any battery power that might have been on this aircraft was gone. But this notation was made. Here, signs of recent habitation were clearly visible, but repeated circling and zooming failed to elicit any answering wave from possible inhabitants. And it was finally taken for granted that no one were at the western end of the island. Were there, comma. At the western end of this island, a tramp steamer of 4,000 tons lay high and almost dry, head onto Coral Beach, back broken in 2 places. The lagoon at Gardner looked sufficiently deep and certainly large enough so a seaplane or even an airboat could have landed and taken off in any direction with little if any difficulty, given a chance. It's believed that Miss Earhart could have landed and swum and waded ashore, said senior aviator of the USS Colorado to the chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics. Aircraft search of Earhart's plane listing. After the commander, Captain Friedel made no note of a recent habitation in his official summary. 1940, figure out the timing here, British colonial officer Gerald Gallagher found a female skeleton and an old-fashioned sextant box under a tree on the opposite side of Gardner Island. Which is Phoenix Island now, which was the Phoenix Islands and is now Nicamaroro of the Republic of Kiribati. Anyway, in 1941, British colonial authorities took detailed measurements of the bones that were scattered apparently by scavenger animals. They were determined to be from a 5-foot, 5-inch tall man. Then the bones were lost and they weren't able to retrieve them. But in 1998, an analysis of the measurement data collected that day by forensic anthropologists concluded that the skeleton probably belonged to a tallish white female of northern European ancestry from all the description data. Artifacts discovered on Nicamaroro have included improvised tools, an aluminum panel, possibly from an Electra from the 1930s, made using 1930s manufacturer's specifications for aluminum, which would decay over time in the salt water and air. Also matched the shape of a panel that was used to patch a window in the aircraft. An oddly cut piece of clear plexiglass of the same thickness and curvature and statistics and specifications of an Electra window, an Electra aircraft. And a size 9 cat's paw heel from the 1930s for lady. October 1937, just after Amelia Earhart's disappearance, a photograph was done of the Norwich City wreck on the Nicamaroro Reef. Decades later, it was enhanced and showed what experts said was a blurry object sticking out of the water in the lower left-hand corner. Yeah, I've got a link to it. It's a black and white photo. It's consistent with the strut and wheel of a Lockheed Electra landing gear. It's on the northwest corner, and the bones are found on the southeast corner. A broken antenna, no training about a piece of equipment, set of assumptions made by some people, and a sad error. Thanks for watching. Have a good day. Good luck with that.